Thank you. You know the old saying, they save the best for last. I fear that's not true today. As he said, I defended my dissertation less than 2 weeks ago, and I'm just now getting started at Williams in Walnut Ridge. So I'm going to try to tie some of this together and talk about, this should really be entitled The Constitution of 1874 and Post-Reconstruction Politics, is where I should have probably gone with that. So just keep that in mind. So I've been tasked with talking about the rise of redeemers in Arkansas and really post-Reconstruction politics. So as we've learned today, the Brooks-Baxter War is kind of a jumping off point for that. It's the beginning of the end, is what I would say. So let's look at Elijah Baxter is where I'm going to start with. I'm going to cut just a little bit of material. So Elijah Baxter really is going to play the one trump card in his arsenal during the conflict. He's going to flirt with, or he's going to promise Democrats, many of whom had been supporting Brooks at the onset of the conflict, and he's going to flirt with them or tease them or make promises, we'll never know for sure, but that he would throw his support behind Democratic efforts in the General Assembly to enact a constitutional amendment re-enfranchising former Confederates. And so on March 3rd, 1873, the voters of Arkansas are going to go to the polls, and they're going to overwhelmingly, 10-1 in fact, support this amendment to return voting rights to former Confederates. So this vote essentially assures Democrats that they will regain control of state government on a statewide basis, at least. In many counties, Democrats will not regain control for years to come, or at least a few years to come. In the meantime, though, now that Democrats are re-enfranchised, or at least former Confederates are re-enfranchised, conservatives are re-enfranchised, they have to deal with a state government that was elected in 1872. And so really they're going to get an ace in the hole due to resignations, due to gubernatorial appointments. The state Senate, the state House have a lot of vacancies, and so there's a special election called to fill those. The special election takes place on November 4th, 1873. And in this election, Democrats secure a commanding victory. Their parties return to control in the General Assembly, both the House and the Senate. And really, from this point on, we can say that Democrats are going to not only control the legislature, but hold sway over the governor's office, because Baxter really has no more Republican allies. So redemption is well underway here, since they control all of this. But the Redeemers would not be happy until they had wiped away many or all of the vestiges of what we might call radical Republican rule. The Constitution of 1868 stood in the way of that goal. Therefore, it had to go as far as many Democrats were concerned. Baxter, along with Democratic majorities in both houses and the General Assembly, moved to draft this new Constitution for the state. I'm going to skip. Here's one of my favorite quotes about redemption from Edward Ayers. It says that redemption did not descend in a sudden rush of Democratic glory, but arrived slowly, tentatively, awkwardly. I think that's true for Arkansas, that it's small steps. We've seen this image already today. This is Baxter and Brooks. I'm going to skip over that. We've heard all about them already. So there's our special election. Democrats retake the General Assembly, and that the Democrats hold this total sway. So the next thing that happens, though, is that Baxter agrees with the Democrats, or maybe he gives in to the Democrats if he's not 100% behind it, but he agrees to have a new constitutional convention. The Republicans had written a constitution in 1868, and so now the Democrats want to provide a new charter. So they call this election for this new constitution, and it's a two-part election. The first question is a yes or no. Will we or will we not have a constitutional convention? And the second part of that is that you are to elect your delegate or delegates, depending on your county. And so this is going to kick off this election. I'll tell you right up front that the yes or no part is an overwhelming yes. In fact, the vote is 80,259 to 8,547. The other part is not quite as conclusive. It's going to really boil down to factions within the Democratic Party. It's going to pit what literature calls often new departure Democrats. These are Democrats who had ceased to oppose Reconstruction, at least openly. They had accepted many Republican policies. They sought to be seen as loyal to the Union. And at least on the surface, they were accepting of African American rights. So it's going to pit these new departure Democrats against so-called straight-out Democrats, or often called Bourbon Democrats. And these Bourbon Democrats are going to be more conservative. Where new departure Democrats sought to use the power of government to spur economic development, to energize the economy, to build the state up, these Bourbon or conservative Democrats didn't like that idea. Both groups, though, are going to charge Republicans with saddling the state with high taxes, with a high tax burden, which they said limited the state's ability to recover from the war and from Reconstruction. Both sides are going to also charge the Republican regimes with corruption. These straight-out Democrats, as I've already said, they're more conservative. They're going to be more closely tied to the older ideology of Jefferson and Jackson. And these two groups of Democrats are going to fight it out in this election. This is the election for delegates. The best example I can give you today, this is something I'm still working on, but the best example I can give you today is in Sebastian County, where there's going to be a hard-fought election. So the first part is conclusive, as I've already said. That vote is automatically conclusive. So we're going to have a constitutional convention. When it came to the election of delegates, the Democrats are going to capture 70 of the 91 seats. So Democrats are going to have a majority. But the question is, are they new departure Democrats or straight-out Bourbon Democrats? So I want to admit right up front, I'm still working on this. When I wrote my dissertation, it's not even included. That's how I didn't get that far. So let's roll right into the convention. The convention is going to open on July 14th in 1874, right here in this building. Imagine this building with no air conditioning, a very hot July. The Gazette says 2 people had died earlier that week of heat exhaustion, in fact. That's how hot it was. So right upstairs, they're going to start this convention. It's an interesting group of people who've traditionally been seen as a distinguished group of individuals. The group included 2 former governors, Henry M. Rector and Harris Flanagan. It's really one of my favorite stories of the convention is how these 2 former governors, and Flanagan had defeated Rector during the Civil War for the governorship. I always tell my Arkansas history students that Flanagan was fighting in Tennessee when he ran against Rector. And it's inconclusive how much Flanagan knew about his own campaign. But one thing for sure, Rector had trouble running against Flanagan. As I tell my students, how do you call the guy you're running against an SOB if he's getting shot at? So the convention contained 3 future governors, James P. Eagle, Simon P. Hughes, and Henry Fishback, and 2 future justices of the Arkansas Supreme Court, Henry Bunn and John Aiken. These delegates appear to have been highly thought of in their own time as well as later. Writing some years later, J.W. House, who was a delegate from White County, put it this way: "It is universally conceded that as a whole, it," meaning the convention, "was composed of the ablest men who ever assembled in the state in any legislative or political capacity. And we think it's generally conceded that there's been no equal since that time." So they thought highly of themselves as well. The typical delegate was white. They were all male. As we've already stated, the majority was Democrats. It has been suggested that delegates to the convention shared an agrarian interest that helped shape their political positions. And while it's true that these men, even those who made their living through the practice of law or medicine, often owned substantial land holdings that tied them to the agrarian interest, biographical data of those delegates, along with the examination of the debates and proceedings of the convention, show that this body wasn't nearly as homogeneous a group as we might think. Well, for one thing, I would throw in there that to be from the agrarian interest in Randolph County or Polk County is very different than to be from the agrarian interest in Phillips County or Chico County. Delegates to the convention possessed a broad range of political and governmental experience as well. Of the 79 Democrats elected to the convention, 32 possessed some prior political experience. 10 of these Democrats had served in the 1861 secession convention. None, by the way, had served in the 1864 Constitutional Convention, and 3 of the Democrats had been delegates in 1868. Oddly enough, little attention has been given to these delegates' prior political experience. While it's true that many, if not most, of these delegates had some connection to the previously mentioned agrarian interest, their prior political activity and positions have not been evaluated really to determine if this agrarian interest played a role in their decisions, the convention, or elsewhere. Of these Democrats who possessed some level of political experience, only 2 possessed county level support. I'm getting behind on my slides here. So only 2 had possessed only county level political activities. That's Stephen Bates of Polk County, and he had actually served as a justice of the peace in 2 states, Georgia and then Arkansas. And then Charles Bowen of Mississippi County, who served as deputy sheriff and then sheriff. Bowen, interestingly enough, would also be the Klan leader for eastern Arkansas. 15 members of the delegation had previously served in the General Assembly between secession and the end of Reconstruction. And 6 of these Democrats had held statewide office. As we've already talked about, 2 were governor. 1, John Hampton, the president of the Senate, had been acting governor. John Roan had left the state once. Allen Witt of Van Buren County had held the office of state land commissioner for 1 term. And this gentleman, Grandison Royston, had been in the first Constitutional Convention in 1836. He also served at least half of the first legislative session as Speaker of the House after the first Speaker of the House is killed or thrown out of the chamber for murdering another member. So both Grandison Royston and Hugh French Thomason had served as prosecuting attorneys. So they had some limited federal experience. 4 of these Democrats could also claim some degree of national experience: Royston, Thomason, and Rufus Garland. These 3 men had served as Confederate congressmen. In fact, Garland would defeat Royston for a seat in the Confederate Congress. He did this by taking advantage of the growing anti-war sentiment in the state late in the war. In fact, Garland is sometimes called a Confederate Copperhead because he was an anti-war candidate. Of course, it didn't help that Royston had a military-aged son who refused to enlist, and instead he persisted in traveling all over the state. It was very obvious that he was against the war. This provided a great political embarrassment for the older Royston. And then lastly, William Fishback had been appointed U.S. Senator in 1864, but was never seated. And Fishback's one of these interesting guys in the convention. He's going to be in the secession convention. He's going to eventually vote to secede, and then he's going to hightail it to Missouri, where he's going to declare his allegiance to the Union almost immediately. He's going to edit a newspaper, and when Little Rock falls, he's going to come back as a Republican and edit a newspaper there before he eventually becomes a Democrat. So Democrats serving in the convention also differed when it came to occupation and place of birth. There were 34 farmers in the delegation. Now, there were many more who owned farms, but people who made their living farming, there were 34 farmers in the delegation. 10 of those were members of the Grange. There was one member of the Grange in Arkansas who was not a farmer, by the way. There were also 32 lawyers, 3 ministers, 7 doctors, and 2 merchants. We should point out that not all professions are easy to establish, meaning that you might be a lawyer and a farmer. Or in the case of James Eagle, you're a minister and a farmer. And to call James Eagle a farmer is a little bit disingenuous because he's a major planter. In addition, some of these delegates, they practice more than one profession, I've already said that. Of the Democrats elected to the convention, 11 were native Arkansans. So, not a huge percentage here are native Arkansans. The largest number, 28, came from Tennessee. And that's a pattern that goes way back in Arkansas history. Virginia was represented with 7. And then there's a sprinkling here from Kentucky, North Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, and interestingly enough, New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Harris Flanagan is the one from New Jersey. And he was educated in a Quaker school. I always find this interesting. But yet he comes to Arkansas and he's a Confederate governor. So I find that has always interested me. So the delegates who won seats in the 1874 Constitutional Convention, the Democratic caucus or the Conservative caucus, were united under a banner of democracy. But in many ways, that was only superficial. Historians and political scientists have most often focused on the like-mindedness of these delegates. All too often, scholars have asserted that little division existed in this group. But if these scholars are to be believed, then the 1874 Arkansas Constitutional Convention would be an exception to the rule, because other southern states, their conventions had a lot of controversy. A close reading of the convention journal calls assertions that Democrats in the convention were harmonious and homogeneous into doubt. In reality, this Democratic caucus was not as united under the banner of democracy as one might assume. While they all identified as conservatives or Democrats, that distinction, or what it meant to be a Democrat after the war, had not fully formed. In other words, these Democrats were not united, at least strictly, under a set of democratic beliefs. Some within the delegation had been Whigs prior to the war. This often meant that they embraced an expansive notion of government. Others had been Unionists who had only reluctantly supported secession. Delegates to this convention also possessed varied economic interests and faced different political circumstances at home as well. Delegates who came to the convention possessing varying degrees of government and political experience thought of things differently than people who had never held office. But these redeemers ultimately drafted a constitution that rolled back most of the quote-unquote reforms undertaken by Republicans in 1868 and afterwards. These Democrats sought to weaken the office of governor, following what they saw as abuses during the Colin Powell administration, Powell-Clayton administration. Wow. First, Democratic Constitution makers reduced the term of office for the governor from 4 years to 2 years. So he's going to have to go back to be elected every 2 years. This change is going to apply to other constitutional officers as well. It's going to apply to all of the constitutional offices. While Clayton had been granted extensive appointment powers, Constitution makers sought to severely curtail the powers of the governor. Under the new Constitution, most state offices would become subject to popular election, not gubernatorial appointment. Redeemers also went after money. They reduced the salary of the executive office, and they stipulated the governor and other officers' salaries within the Constitution. They actually put the number in the Constitution. Another avenue where Redeemers reduced or weakened the office of governor was providing the General Assembly the power to override a gubernatorial veto with a simple majority. But these Redeemers didn't exclusively level their actions at the executive branch. Many of them were pointed right at the legislature as well. Many Redeemers viewed the legislative branch with just as much venom. Many Redeemer Democrats simply did not trust future legislators, even those that without a doubt would be Democratic. So they sought to put as many restrictions as possible in the Constitution. Ultimately, Constitution makers enacted measures that limited the General Assembly as well as local governments from raising unlimited amounts of revenue. These measures were restrictive, though I found while writing my dissertation that some within the Democratic delegation wanted the document to be more restrictive. So in many ways, there were those forces fighting for more restrictions. Now these, especially the financial restrictions, are going to eventually compound many of the state's problems. It's going to limit the state's ability to address financial need. It's going to limit the state's ability to provide basic services such as education, and limit the state's ability to provide for economic development and infrastructure. Now traditionally, this has been seen as a reaction or response to what the public and Democratic leaders saw as the abuses of the tax system by these radical Republicans. When it came to the legislative branch, Democrats differed on some of their finer points. Some Democratic Constitution makers sought to place more severe restrictions on the legislative branch. One even wanted to limit the legislature to meeting every 4 years instead of every 2 years, which would have just served to make the governor's office all that much more powerful. In other instances, Constitution makers set limits on taxation, on state government assistance when it came to internal improvements, and limited the state's role in education. There is no doubt that Democrats were anxious to roll back many of the things radical Republicans had done. But all too often, this historical interpretation has not gone far enough. I argue that they are also partaking in a national movement here. That it's not just about limitation. Now that's the best part of it, they would probably say. But in other words, Democrats were redeeming Arkansas by doing a lot of times what's happening in the North, in the West, and the rest of the South. I argue that we tend too often to see the South as compartmentalized or distinct. Yes, there's no denying that Democrats in Arkansas were reacting to the abuses of Reconstruction, both real and perceived. But these Democrats were also partaking in, or at least heavily influenced by regional and national trends. And these regional and national trends deserve a greater examination. And they may very well change some of our perceived notions concerning redemption in Arkansas or elsewhere. So these Arkansas Constitution makers are partaking in a national political movement. Keep in mind, it serves their purpose or they wouldn't be doing it. A movement that saw state governments in the South, the North, and the West turn away from a more active or positive government and embrace a more limited idea, the ideas of retrenchment and reform. Constitution makers were partaking of the same constitutional language that can be found to some extent in Pennsylvania, Illinois, West Virginia, Colorado, Nebraska, Montana, just to name a few. The Arkansas Redeemer Constitution was not written in a vacuum, in other words. Rather, it was part of an ongoing political change taking place in the nation. Having said that, getting rid of the Republican-drafted 1868 Constitution and the government that it provided was paramount in these conservative or Democrats' eyes. Though divisions persisted through the convention, and you can read through the journal, which I took 2 years to transcribe from handwritten microfilm, that's on microfilm. You can read through there and talk about their fights, where the Democrats are at each other's throats about certain issues, but in the end, they're going to come together and support this Constitution. Though divisions persisted throughout the convention as to how extreme or draconian the Constitution would be, Democrats fought each other on many issues, but these squabbles would set the tone for future political disagreements. But in the end, they're going to vote for the Constitution. Now, so the ratification process. We've talked about what the new Constitution does. So to ratify this, you would expect a massive campaign to get out the vote. And that just simply didn't take place in Arkansas. It seems to be a very subdued campaign. Unlike some other states, for instance, Texas, where the Democratic Party didn't even really endorse the Constitution because of the divisions. In Arkansas, the campaign to ratify the new Constitution drew little opposition. It may be because Democrats in the convention came together to support the document at the end of the convention, or it may be a testament to the weakness of these groups who would oppose the new Constitution. But on October 13, 1874, the voters of the state approved the new Constitution, a little over 74,000 to 23,000. And the Democrats swept every statewide office. Democrats would control 31 seats in the state Senate, and with Republicans holding 2 seats. Democrats won 80 seats in the state House, and the Republicans won 10. But Redeemers achieving their goals of ridding the state of the Republican Constitution didn't mean their job was done. Now Democrats had to govern the state. While the convention may have been a fractured group that produced a constitution not as severe as some had wished, the coming General Assembly would relieve many of those fears. The General Assembly is going to meet in November of 1874 in an extraordinary session, and they're going to meet until March of 1875. And here, conservative legislators are going to move to solidify their control over the state's tax structure. Now, the convention had set one limit of taxation. Legislators are not going to meet that limit. In other words, they're going to constantly come in under what they could do. They're going to keep taxes as low as possible. They're going to place the power to assess property in the hands of assessors who were elected locally. This removed the power from the hands of assessors appointed by the government and put the power in the hands of local interest. In many counties, this meant that local farm interests were now in control of their own tax burden. Property assessments declined throughout the state. The General Assembly refuses to levy taxes to the limit that the new Constitution allowed. They, in fact, only levied 6 mills to pay for state government, to pay interest on the debt, and to support common schools. And this pattern is going to hold in preceding legislatures. While it is not conclusive in the election for the Constitutional Convention, whether the new departure or straight-out Bourbon Democrats won the day, it's obvious that Bourbon Democrats would control the coming legislatures. That's all I have. Okay. Any questions? Yes.
Rodney, why do you think we still use the term redeemer? Because it's so loaded with all the religious sanctions. You know, it's like a Dunning School term that we're still using.
Yep. I don't have a good answer for you. I know that I tried to sneak a title past Patrick Williams that played off of that, and he wanted to know what the heck it was. So, so yeah, I don't really know why we stick to that term.
Are there alternative terms that people?
Yeah, I don't know what they would be. Yeah. Yes.
You say that this is part of a national trend.
Mm-hmm.
This is the days before the internet and
Right.
distribution of common documents. I know that that the entire South is paralyzed by this same movement. And there are only two other constitutions that are worse than ours. Louisiana and Texas.
Right.
I'm not aware of that being a national thing. I was much more aware of the fact that across the South,
Right.
by all of the reactive people who were mostly reacting against majority black legislatures.
What you see nationally is turning against spending priorities, for example, or placing limitations on government. And you mentioned no internet, which is, I think, one of the more interesting things is that there are whole books of constitutional language that circulated. There's a couple of them on Google Books that you can pull up and look at that are constitutional phrases or constitutional clauses that you could borrow. And so you can actually go back and you can pinpoint constitutional clauses that appear in Arkansas, that appear in Missouri, that appear in Texas, and or Illinois even, all of these constitutions. So yeah, they're not reacting to the same things necessarily in Illinois or in Ohio where a constitution fails, but they're a lot of times using the same language to address issues.
Well, it's one thing to have a philosophy of limited government. It's quite another
Yeah.
thing to tie the hands of the people who run your business and to limit their ability to do the business that you expect them to do.
Right.
And it was severe in Arkansas and not necessary.
And we still use that constitution, though highly amended. Anybody else? Yes?
Wasn't it also true that there was a trend in the whole United States to rewrite the Constitution?
Right.
State level?
Right. Everybody wants to write a constitution, essentially. Of course, you also have the West, new states coming about, which means new constitutions as well. And they're pulling from some of the same ideas.